Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a topic, well, can get a little controversial in certain Christian circles. We're looking at women as pastors.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one for sure. Lots of different opinions out there.
Yeah, exactly. And for today's deep dive, we've got this booklet. The title translates to Woman Pastor, How Much Truth, How Much Illusion. It's written by Brother Binod Kumar.
Okay, interesting.
So basically, we're going to try to understand how he's using the Bible to say that women shouldn't be pastors.
Sounds like a good plan. Let's see what he has to say.
All right, so he starts out right off the bat, goes to Romans 16.1. Now, this verse is like kind of a key battleground in this whole discussion. It talks about Phoebe, who's called a servant of the church. What's Brother Binod Kumar doing with that?
So right away, he gets into the original Greek words, which, is pretty common in these types of discussions.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it gets right into the weeds.
Exactly. So he points out that the word for servant here is diakonon, which he says, just means a servant or a helper. It could be a man. It could be a woman.
Okay.
But, and this is where it gets a little tricky, he says this is different from the Greek word doulos, which he translates as bond servant. And he says that word doulos, that's the word used for servants of the Lord, like in the sense of really being under the Lord's authority.
I see. So he's making a distinction between different kinds of serving, different levels of authority, maybe.
All right. And he uses this to say, look, just because Phoebe is called a servant of the church doesn't mean she was a pastor or had any kind of real authority in the church.
Okay, interesting. So are there other places where this word, this diakonon, shows up? Does he give any examples?
Yeah, he does. Like, for instance, he points to Galatians 2.17, where diakonon is used in a situation that has nothing to do with leading a church.
Okay, so he's saying the word itself doesn't automatically mean someone is a leader.
Exactly. He also goes on to talk about the difference between a servant, which he connects more to just, doing work, and a slave, which is about being under someone's authority. He even uses some Bible verses to back that up. For slave, he gives Matthew 6.24 and Ephesians 6.6. And then for servant, he mentions Luke 10.4 and Romans 12.4.
Wow, he's really building a case here. So how does this all connect back to Phoebe?
Well, he's basically saying that for him, Paul was just saying Phoebe was a true believer who served and helped people. And Paul was probably asking the Roman believers to help her with whatever she needed.
Okay, so not a pastor, more like, a volunteer?
Yeah, something like that, a dedicated helper.
All right, so that's his take on Romans 16.1. But then there's these other verses, right, that talk about women being silent in church, not teaching or having authority over men.
Yeah, absolutely. He goes straight from Phoebe to those verses in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. The ones he highlights are 1 Corinthians 14.34-35 and 1 Timothy 2.11-14. And he really doesn't think those verses need much explanation.
Oh, really? He thinks they're pretty clear-cut.
Yeah, he pretty much says they're just straightforward. Women should be quiet in church and not teach or lead men. That's it.
Okay, so no room for different interpretations there, according to him.
Not really, though he does give a little bit of geographical context. He reminds us that Cenchreae was the eastern port of Corinth, and that Paul set up a church there on his second missionary trip. And then later, another church popped up in Cenchreae, like 7 miles from the first one.
Okay, but I'm not quite seeing how that connects to his argument about women in ministry.
Well, it's more about setting the stage for the question he asks next. He basically says, could the same Paul, who just told women not to speak or teach in church, turn around and introduce Phoebe as a female pastor? And his answer is a big fat never.
I see. So it's about Paul being consistent in his teachings.
Exactly. He hammers that point home by quoting 1 Corinthians 14.37-38, where Paul says his instructions are actually the Lord's commands, so you got to follow them.
Makes sense.
And then he asks, again, if Paul would ever go against the Lord's commands by promoting a woman as a pastor. And again, the answer is never.
All right, so he's really emphasizing Paul's authority here.
Oh, yeah, big time. And he backs it up by pointing to a bunch of verses where Paul tells people to imitate him, just like he imitates Christ. He uses 1 Corinthians 11.1, Philippians 3.17, Philippians 4.9, 1 Thessalonians 1.6, and 2 Thessalonians 3.9. He's saying that Paul must have had a really good reason to talk about being imitated.
Yeah, that's a lot of verses to support that idea.
Right. And then he throws out another one of his rhetorical questions. He basically asks, would Paul, who's telling everyone to be like him, would he make a huge mistake by putting Phoebe forward as a female pastor? And again, never.
So he's really driving home this point that Paul would never contradict himself on this issue. But if Phoebe wasn't a pastor, what does he think she was doing?
Okay, so this is where he gets into the more traditional view of women's roles. He figures Phoebe was probably an older lady, someone people respected, kind of like the qualities described in Titus 2.35.
Okay, I see.
And he thinks that's why Paul trusted her to take his letter to the church in Rome. Then he goes back to 1 Timothy 2.1, 11, 15, those verses we talked about earlier that talk about women being silent and not teaching.
Yeah.
He admits that on the surface, it might seem like these restrictions are making women less important in the church.
Well, yeah, if they can't teach or preach or have authority, what are they supposed to do?
Right, that's exactly the point he brings up. But then he focuses in on verse 15, the one that says, "But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety."
Okay, I remember that one. That verse can be a little confusing, though.
Yeah, he gets that. He says that it's not talking about women's spiritual salvation, like going to heaven or hell. He's saying it's about the importance of their role in the church.
Interesting.
He really emphasizes the importance of raising godly children, bringing them up in the faith. He even quotes that saying, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world."
Ah, yeah, I've heard that one before.
He then points to examples like Susanna Wesley. She was the mother of John and Charles Wesley, and he argues that her ministry at home had a huge impact on the world, even though she never preached from a pulpit.
Wow, okay.
He also uses the story of Pharaoh's daughter asking Moses' mother to nurse him from Exodus 2.9. He's basically saying that women can have a powerful influence even without holding official leadership positions.
So he sees motherhood, or at least raising children in the faith, as a really crucial role for women.
Absolutely. He even suggests that, on Judgment Day, the biggest surprise might be how highly God rewards women who dedicated their lives to raising their kids to follow him.
That's a thought-provoking idea.
Yeah, for sure. And he ties this all back to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He basically says that women will be the reason their children are saved, like spiritually saved.
So he's connecting it back to the very beginning of the Bible.
Exactly. He's saying that a woman's place in the church isn't about standing up and preaching. He thinks that raising God-fearing children is way more important in God's eyes.
Okay, so that's how he wraps up his argument.
Pretty much. He ends the booklet with a benediction. One of those traditional blessings.
All right, so let me see if I can sum this up. Brother Bandit Kumar's main point is that women shouldn't be pastors. He gets there by interpreting specific Bible passages, especially the ones about Phoebe and the verses that talk about women being silent in church. He puts a lot of weight on the different Greek words for servant, and he really believes that Paul would never go against what he saw as God's commands.
Yep, that's the gist of it. He sees raising godly children as the most important thing a woman can do in the church.
It's definitely a very specific interpretation. I mean, he builds a pretty solid case based on those particular passages.
Oh, yeah. He definitely picks his verses carefully and interprets them in a way that supports his viewpoint.
That makes you think, though, right? I mean, are there other ways to understand those same verses? Like, what about all the different gifts people have within a church community? Could those gifts be used in different ways? Just something to ponder.
Yeah, for sure. Lots to think about there.
Thanks for diving into this with me. Always fascinating to see how people approach these complex topics.
Absolutely. It's been great. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.